Hi, this is your buddy Quinn, and this is the video introduction to the 1966 film, The Battle of Algiers. Battle of Algiers is an Italian-Algerian co-production with an Italian director named Gillo Pontecorvo, and it's really one of the most remarkable war films ever made. In addition to being a great war film, it's also a masterpiece of filmmaking. It's worth talking a little bit about the Algerian context at the beginning of this introduction, because so much of this film depicts actual events that took place in what is now known as the Algerian War of Independence. The film is 1966. The Algerian War of Independence takes place over an extended period of time, about 8 years, from 1954 to 1962. So one of the remarkable things about this film is how recent the events depicted in the film actually were. This film covers a portion of that war. So if the entire Algerian War of Independence is 1954 to 1962, this film largely focuses on the first 3 years. Those first 3 years were collectively known as the Battle of Algiers. The Battle of Algiers is not a traditional battle. It was much more a series of violent events that were initiated in part by a rebel movement known as the Algerian Liberation Front, or the FLN. So FLN stands for Front de Libération Nationale. And the responses to those revolutionary acts on the part of the French forces. The Algerian Independence War was one of the bloodiest and longest of all of the colonial independence wars that took place around the world. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the process. It was one of the most violent and extended nationalist wars for a few reasons that were quite unique to Algeria. So one was that Algeria was a settler colony. Not all colonies had European settlers in them, but Algeria had a lot of them. And they had also settled in Algeria for a very long period of time. Algeria was invaded by the French all the way back in 1830. So by the time we get to the events detailed in this film, we're talking about 124 years after the fact. And in the course of that 124 years, you have a very large number of European settlers, largely French, some Italians as well, that settle in Algeria and essentially exploit the labor of the indigenous population. They alienate many of them from their lands. But by the time we get to the 1950s, there are more than 1 million European settlers in Algeria, and that makes up about 13% of the population at the time. They were collectively known as pieds noirs. Pieds noirs in French means black feet, probably because they wore black shoes, in contrast to the traditional sandals of the indigenous population. Partly because of this large settler population, it made it very difficult for France not to intervene in this war, and it made it very difficult for them to let go. Algeria had special status in France. It was different from other colonies or protectorates. It was known as a département, which is much like a state would be in the United States. And so even though it was not contiguous to France, you might think of Algeria as having the same kind of political status as, say, Alaska or Hawaii do in the United States. But native Algerians, by and large, do not have the full privileges of citizenship, which made it very difficult for them to feel fully French. France also had a bad experience in World War II. It was occupied by the Nazis. After World War II, as it emerged victorious with the Allies, it had a very difficult time retaining control over its very vast colonial empire, which was in Africa, primarily North and West Africa, and as well as in Southeast Asia, in what was known as Indochine or Indochina. In 1954, there was a very important battle that had a big psychological effect on the French. It was happened in Vietnam. It was called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and the French lost this battle, in part due to some strategic errors. But I think their status in France was, or in Vietnam, was always quite tenuous. And this loss at Dien Bien Phu essentially made it very difficult for the French to stay any longer in Asia, and it dealt them a very significant psychological blow. So by the time we get to the start of the Algerian War, France is is very sensitive about the loss of its colonial empire, has decided to essentially throw all of its eggs in the Algerian basket to make sure that no matter what, it does ultimately preserve Algeria. And it's willing to put a lot of troops on the ground to make that happen. The FLN, the Front de Libération Nationale, is depicted as the main rebel group in this movie. In the mid-1950s, it was actually contesting for power with not only with the Pieds Noirs, not only with the French government, but also with other Algerians and also some other revolutionary movements that were contesting its authority. The FLN is ultimately going to win out. We're going to see some of the reasons for that in the course of this film. It uses more violent tactics, more authoritarian tactics. It ultimately forces the moderates out of the picture and develops its own army, the ALN, the Armée de Libération Nationale. And as the war progresses, the FLN becomes increasingly vicious and maintains its ascendancy over the other rebel groups that will allow it to ultimately triumph and take power in government at the end of the war. When the war does end in 1962, it does so in part not because the French were defeated in a major battle, but because public opinion turns against their presence in Algeria, both in the international community and also in the French public. The war had so polarized the people of Algeria, the European settlers and the native Algerians, that it led to this really remarkable mass exodus in 1962, where more than 1 million people fled Algeria, going back to France, even though many of them had never actually even been to France. They considered themselves Algerian. There were also a lot of indigenous Algerians that fought in the war on the side of the French that feared persecution at the end of the war, and rightly so. And so many of them also fled to France. And France, as a result, has a very large Arab population, largely living in the urban centers and in the suburbs around those urban centers, in part due to its experience with the Algerian War. So this film really starts in 1957, or 1954, goes through 1957, depicting a number of events there. But there is a sequence at the end that takes place in 1960 that foreshadows the end of the war. At the very end of the film, you'll see what is known as this coda of the film that situates the war in its broader context. One of the interesting tensions, I think, in this film is the problem of winning the battle, which the French do in the context of this film because of their military superiority. But they ultimately lose the war. And it's possible to win a battle and lose the support of the population, which ultimately makes your position in the war untenable. This has actually been a major theme in American involvement abroad, right? In Vietnam, which is often compared to the French experience in Algeria, the United States in Iraq, the United States more recently in Afghanistan as well, has always had military supremacy on the ground, but has had a very difficult time ultimately winning the war on its own terms. The Pentagon in the United States, Department of Defense, actually screened this film for many commanders and soldiers going to Iraq in 2003. And it did so for a couple of reasons. One was that it thought it might provide some insight into urban guerrilla warfare, which is one of the themes of the film. But it was also filmed or screened as a cautionary tale about losing the battle of ideas, which has come to pass in many cases of American military involvement. This is a film that has war-related violence. It engages with difficult subject matter around that violence. I think that it does so in productive and not in any way exploitative ways, but sensitive viewers should be aware that war violence is a major part of the film. In terms of genre, this film is often classified as an Italian neorealist film. And Italian neorealism really was at its height at the end of 1940s and the early 1950s. This film is all the way in 1966. And so it is really taking many of the themes and tropes of Italian neorealism, but projecting them in a period of time where Italian neorealism had largely been passed over in Italy. Some of the things that are very reminiscent of Italian neorealism are the use of non-professional actors, the shooting on site. So one of the really remarkable things about this film is that the sequences are shot in the same places where the actual events occurred. And as I mentioned, they were shot very recently after the war had ended, only a few years. This is also the first film to depict North Africans as fully fleshed out characters rather than simply as background. For the director, Gillo Pontecorvo, the Italian director, this is probably his masterpiece. He's a well-known director. He does a number of great films. He's not as prolific as some directors that we've seen, in part because he really puts his heart and soul into a film, and it often takes 5 or 7 years for him to make one of these new films. But this really shows the care that he puts into the Battle of Algiers. It required a great deal of planning. He is a political leftist, although I think he works extra hard to make sure that that's not, it doesn't come through very much in this film. He tries to make a balanced film that speaks to the anxieties, the grievances, the rationale of both the colonizer and the colonized in this film. And that breaks down a little bit in the closing sequence as we see that the Algerians are ultimately going to win this war. And it feels a little bit like that's the natural course of history, I think, for the director. But in the course of the film, we really see, quite close up the perspectives of the various combatants in a way that I think makes this film stand the test of time. One other thing I love about this film is the musical score. So Ennio Morricone, probably the most famous of the screen composers in Italy, does this amazing musical score. It's heavily influenced by drumming. It has a very raw, suspenseful sound to it. He actually did the score to his most famous film, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, in the same year. As Italian neorealism would suggest, the actors in this film are largely non-professional, and they have some great performances. Part of the strength of those performances is the director really wearing them down. He would sometimes make them shoot the same scene 20 times, 30 times until people were just exhausted. And the weariness comes across in their face, much like it might in a battle situation. You will potentially notice that there's some dubbing over the voices of some of these actors. It was done in the original production in part because these non-professionals didn't have the voices or the lines that the director really needed. And so he would have their lines dubbed over by people with the voices that he wanted. There is one professional actor in this film. He's a stage actor. He is Jean Martin, and he plays the French paratrooper colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Mathieu in the film, a central character in the film. Lieutenant Colonel Mathieu is a composite character of several French commanders, including paratrooper commanders like Jacques Massu, but also others. He's also a very interesting character in his own right that speaks a lot to his suitability for this role. So he had a history of opposing the Algerian War. He'd signed a letter in favor of Algerian independence in 1960. That got him blacklisted from the stage in France. He did have military experience, just like the character that he plays. He fought the Nazis for the Free French. He was also a paratrooper in Indochina, much like his character in Algeria. So a few things I think make this film particularly special. Structurally, it is interesting. It's not terribly complex. Most of the film is a flashback from the opening sequence. That opening sequence comes back near the end of the film. And then the resolution to that sequence is filmed through. And then, as I mentioned, there's this final ending coda to the film that sets the events depicted in the film in its broader context. One thing that this film is famous for is its grainy documentary style film. So Pontecorvo could have filmed this in color. He chose to film it in black and white. And it makes it look, in many ways, like a series of newsreels. So the cinematography looks like reportage, often using telephoto close-ups, sometimes unstable handheld cameras, make you feel a little bit like you are a war correspondent covering this. There are French soldiers often between you, the viewer, and the action, and so it makes it look like the viewer is a bit of a voyeur into a political conflict that they don't totally understand but are trying to come to grips with. The use of crowds is really remarkable throughout, particularly during the ending sequence. Thousands of extras were used in this film, and these were just people from Algiers that ended up reprising their own political experience in the war. There are some really careful, realistic touches. One is the character who plays Jafar. Jafar is played by an actor named Sadi Youssef. Sadi Youssef actually is more or less playing himself in this film. He was an FLN commander. He's the one Algerian rebel commander that makes it out, and he comes back to reprise his role. Much of the film was based on his memoirs that he wrote in a French prison during the course of the war. And believe it or not, he's still a senator in the Algerian government at the age of 92. There's also a young rebel woman who was an actual rebel in the FLN. She's depicted early on in the film. She gets married early in the film. The man executed in prison early in the film was also sentenced in real life to be executed by the French authorities, but was not. The building that is blown up at the end of the film, it is rebuilt and then blown up on the exact site where the original house was destroyed. You know, this is the kind of film that could easily become a propaganda film, but Pontecorvo does a good job of avoiding any direct propaganda for one side or the other. He toned down the perspective from the FLN memoirs. He gave space for French justifications for the war. He highlighted abuses on all sides. Even with those efforts, though, the film was banned in France for 5 years. It came out at a time when the Algerian war was being heavily debated in France, and it was a very sensitive issue. This film has been really influential on a wide range of directors. One of them in particular that you may know is Christopher Nolan, who's making some of the best films of the contemporary period. He sees this film as particularly influential on films like Dunkirk or The Dark Knight Rises, two of his more famous films. So some things that I invite you to watch out for. One is the spatial orientation of the city and the way that that's depicted in the film. In North African cities, there is a medieval core, the Arab core, and then there is next to that core, usually a French quarter of the city that's organized in much more straight lines along French models. And so that Arab core is called the Kasbah. The Kasbah is often higher, set up on a hill. It's a maze of winding alleys and medieval style architecture. And we see both parts of the city in this film. So the camera, you'll notice, is very good at panning between one part of the city to another, seeing people come down from the Kasbah or go up to the Kasbah, down to the French quarters of the city. If you pay careful attention, you'll also notice at the very end of the film that there is a third space depicted where the protests take place in 1960 in the film. And that is in an area where the French tried to build big urban housing to accommodate Muslim Algerians. That's different than the French quarters. It's different from the old Kasbah. And it is a really interesting space that in some ways is a bridge between the French and Algerian spaces that become really important in the latter part of the conflict. There's a lot about authentic Algerian culture in this film, in part because of the huge number of extras that are used. You'll notice a sound called ululation. Ululation is a sound made when you vibrate your tongue on the back of your throat. It becomes an important part of the soundtrack of this film. It's a sound that's commonly made in the Arab world, particularly by women. It's used for celebration, for celebrating weddings, right? Births, for example. But it can also be used as a way of mobilizing a community, of protesting, and you see some of that in the film as well. The FLN comes to power in part because it is more authoritarian than its competitor movements. And you see some moments in the film where the FLN is really trying to morally cleanse the community. It's trying to get rid of pimps and prostitutes and alcoholics. And the FLN was not fully in control at this time, but it does take authority through some of these moral justifications of authoritarianism that are quite common among revolutionaries. I invite you to think, as you watch the film, a little bit about what resistance means. What does it mean to act in resistance? What is being resisted here? And what are acts of resistance? At one point, a wedding that is sponsored by the FLN is considered to be an act of resistance. And I invite you to think a little bit about why that might be the case. There's some really interesting gender issues in this film. The role of women is very important, both in the actual FLN movement and as well as in the film. There's an extended suspenseful scene where 3 rebel women are on a mission into the French Quarter. It's rightly one of the most celebrated scenes of the film. And I think the wide range of ages we see in the women, the children that we see in the film, and the roles that they play in the resistance is very interesting. One of the big issues that I think makes this film very relevant in the contemporary period is that it deals directly with issues of race, of identity, the intersection of those, of race and identity with policing, for example. So it raises the question of how do you police people in the context of very fraught identity politics? When is policing justified? When is it not? When does policing turn into actual repression or exploitation of people? And that raises a related issue that's common in revolutions, and that is when is violence likely and when is violence justifiable or even morally acceptable? Particularly when you're resisting a very strong adversary that's involved in injustices. One of the most important sequences in the film happens in a press conference where journalists are asking questions to the rebels about the morality of rebel violence. There's also a part of the sequence where the paratrooper colonel is making the case that torture used in interrogation is necessary in certain situations. And so I invite you to think a little bit about where you come down on the morality of violence, particularly against an oppressor. What role might it play? How might people who are protesting in the United States today, protesting issues like police brutality, for example, where there's a clearly superior force on the other side, how might they think about violence as useful, and when might it be immoral? One answer to that in the movie is that the FLN decides explicitly to use violence as a provocation. It knows it can't win in a war of violence, but it uses violence to trigger an overreaction on the part of the French, and thus tries to demonstrate to the broader population the grievances that they should be feeling. Even Osama bin Laden used that explicit justification in 9/11 in trying to provoke the United States into an overreaction in the Muslim world that would set off a cascade of Muslim sympathy for Al-Qaeda and a revolt against American injustices around the world. Finally, there is an important theme in this movie about the control of information. How do you get people to believe that there is hope? How do you get people to lay down their arms? So the importance of controlling information both internationally and among the population of Algiers is really important in this film. And we do have evidence from the war in Algeria that this is, in many respects, how wars are ultimately won or lost. There's particular attention on the part of the rebels to try to demonstrate to the UN that the French are acting unjustly. There's a battle for control of the narrative of what's happening in Algiers by both the French military and the FLN throughout the film that is also particularly interesting. So this film has a great number of issues of contemporary relevance, even if you're not that interested in Algeria, although I think you should be. So much in this film is relevant to issues of control, of authority, of race, of identity, and of intervention in wars that the United States has been very involved in. So I think that you'll find the topics and the questions that it raises to be very rich. I also think that you'll find that the cinematography is extremely powerful, the acting is wonderful, and that this is really one of the great masterworks of international cinema.